the 3rd of September 1260, the Jezreel Valley, Palestine. As the sun barely crested the eastern ridge, it illuminated the terrain. Kitbuka observed the rapid movement of his cavalry. At that moment he was absolutely certain. It is over. The enemy is fleeing again. They had been doing this since dawn, riding out into the open, harassing his flanks, provoking his forward units, and then retreating, feigning hesitation and a lack of readiness for battle. He was well acquainted with this maneuver. He had used it himself. It is the oldest trick in the arsenal of steppe cavalry, and the fact that the enemy was attempting to use it against him seemed almost insulting. One must lure the army into a pursuit, allow them to chase across open ground, and then turn and destroy the opponent. Any capable commander understands how this works. He ordered the pursuit to begin. 10,000 veterans of Baghdad, Damascus, and a dozen cities that no longer exist rode forward with the deep, innate confidence of men who, throughout their entire careers, had never suffered defeat in open combat. There was not a hint of retreat, not a single tactical exit strategy. For them, defeat was merely a theoretical concept. And then, the hills along the entire ridge began to move on 3 sides. An entire army erupted from beneath the trees, cavalry, archers, and units that had spent hours waiting in ambush. They struck Kitbuka's flanks and rear simultaneously. The valley, which a second ago seemed like a killing field for a fleeing enemy, suddenly turned into a trap in which Kitbuka's army found itself caught. The trap did not just snap shut. It triggered with the efficiency of something conceived, practiced, and executed by men who knew exactly how Kitbuka would act, because they were just like him. Let that realization sink in for a moment. These were the same warriors who, 2 years earlier, had sacked Baghdad, a city of 800,000 people, one of the greatest urban centers on earth, protected by walls that had stood for 500 years. The Mongols took it in 12 days, only 12, and when they were finished, eyewitnesses said the Tigris turned black from the ink of thousands of books thrown into the water, and red from the blood of 200,000 to 800,000 people. Estimates vary so widely because no one kept an accurate count. You did not fight the Mongols. You either submitted or you ceased to exist. And yet, this valley in northern Israel, a September morning, an ambush. How could this happen? The simple answer, which can be found in any introductory history overview, is that Hulagu had taken the majority of the army home. That is true, but it is insufficient, because even a diminished Mongol army, though significantly outnumbered, should have possessed immense psychological impact. Cities opened their gates to the Mongols based solely on their reputation before a single arrow was fired. The name alone had worked for 50 years. Something deeper broke at Ain Jalut, something structural, something that had been quietly accumulating for years before Kitbuka rode into that valley. This video is about those structural factors. We will not be recounting the course of the battle. You already know the general features. We will do the more difficult and interesting work, understanding why it was even possible. 6 interconnected reasons. 1 story. Let's begin. If you are watching this channel, I won't waste your time explaining who the Mongols were. You know their history. What you need to understand for this story is the very specific, peculiar state the empire was in by 1260, because by that time, it was a fundamentally different machine than the one that had terrorized Eurasia in the previous half-century. The architect of the last Western campaign was Möngke Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, who seized the throne in 1251 after a brutal internal coup that ousted the line of Ogedi and established his own Toluid branch. Möngke was a serious ruler, disciplined, organized, and truly terrifying on a strategic scale. He simultaneously launched full-scale offensive operations against the southern Song and China in the east and Islamic domains in the west. Not raids, but conquest campaigns with clearly defined objectives. His brother, Hulagu, commanded the Western Front. 1,258, Baghdad. 1,260, Damascus. By April of that year, Mongol cavalry patrols had reached Gaza, literally the doorstep of Egypt. Then Möngke died. In August 1259, he was leading a campaign against the Song somewhere in the Sichuan province. He most likely died of dysentery, though cholera is mentioned in some sources, and a few medieval chronicles suggest a combat wound. The exact cause doesn't actually matter. What matters is the timing, because Möngke's death triggered a mechanism embedded in the fundamental political structure of the Mongol Empire. and this mechanism was destined to change everything that happened in Palestine. According to Mongol custom, recorded in the code of laws established by Genghis Khan and rooted in the political culture of the steppe, when the great Khan died, every high-ranking prince of the blood was obligated to return to the Mongol heartland to participate in the Kurultai, the succession council, a gathering of the royal family to choose the next ruler. This was not a recommendation, but a fundamental obligation rooted in the very organization of the entire empire. The empire belonged to the family collectively, and the family collectively had to decide who would lead it next. Möngke Khan was Möngke's brother. He had a direct and personal interest in who would occupy the next great throne. His departure was non-negotiable, and when he left, he took the main part of his army with him. After all, the struggle for the throne in the Mongol world was not a political process one appeared at without weapons. He left a garrison under the command of his most capable field commander, Kitbuka Noyan, a Naiman Turk and Nestorian Christian who had participated in the Western campaign from the very beginning. The force commanded by Kitbuka has been debated by historians ever since. Contemporary Mamluk chronicles provide absurdly inflated figures. One source cites 100,000, which almost certainly reflects the ancient tradition of exaggerating the size of the enemy to exaggerate the victory. More reliable modern research, including thorough analysis by J. Smith in the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies, estimates Kitbuka's forces at somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 men in total, including Armenian and Georgian vassal contingents, 1 tumen of core Mongol cavalry, plus auxiliary troops, a garrison posing as an invasion force. Now, here is what I find truly remarkable about Hulagu's calculations. He believed this was enough, not because he was reckless, but because he was acting on a pattern with an impeccable track record. You leave a garrison. The garrison projects Mongol power. The remaining enemies, knowing what happens to those who resist, submit out of rational self-preservation. This had worked everywhere. Persia, Iraq, the principalities of Syria. The entire architecture of Mongol expansion in the Middle East was built on the understanding that real combat was often unnecessary, that the shadow of the army was enough. Why should Egypt be any different? Hulagu had no particular reason to think it would be. But a second crack appeared in the Mongol world, which receives too little attention in most accounts of Ain Jalut, and this is critically important for understanding why the defeat could not be answered. Berk, the ruler of the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate controlling the western steppe and, in essence, the supreme overlord of Ruses, had converted to Islam. He was furious about the destruction of Baghdad, and the historian Rashid al-Din Hamadani preserves what is considered Berk's protest to Möngke. He has sacked all the cities of the Muslims and has caused the death of the caliph. With God's help, I will call him to account for so much innocent blood. One Mongol ruler had officially condemned another for excessive violence against Muslims. The unity of the steppe, which was the foundational strength of the empire, was splitting along religious lines. The Mamluks knew this. They operated a complex intelligence network. We will talk more about this later. And they knew that Berk was a Muslim who was not inclined to support his cousin's ambitions. They actively cultivated this relationship, maintaining diplomatic correspondence with the Golden Horde, and positioning themselves as natural partners for a Muslim Mongol ruler who resented the power of the Ilkhanate. What did this mean in strategic terms? Even after Ain Jalut, Hulagu could not simply bring a massive reinforcement army back to Palestine. The most direct routes passed through or near the territory of the Golden Horde, and Berk was not going to allow that. Within a year of the battle, Hulagu and Berk were in open military conflict in the Caucasus. The Ilkhanate was suddenly fighting 2 wars at once, one against the Mamluks in the southwest, one against another Mongol Khanate in the northwest. Internal disagreements of the empire had become a strategic straitjacket. So, let us describe exactly the situation in which Kitbuka found himself. The main army was gone. Reinforcements were politically blocked. The garrison he commanded was operating at the very extreme end of supply lines stretching thousands of miles through terrain that was becoming increasingly hostile to steppe warfare. And his enemy, about whom he clearly had an inadequate intelligence picture, was not the frightened, demoralized force he expected. It was the most dangerous military institution in the medieval Islamic world, led by a commander who had been preparing specifically for this battle for the better part of 2 years. Kitbuka represented not the Mongol Empire at its zenith, but its ghost. There is a pattern that can be traced in the collapse of every great conquest empire in history. and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The Romans faced it in the German forests east of the Rhine. Napoleon faced it on the road from Smolensk to Moscow. The British faced it twice in Afghanistan, the Americans in several places. The essence is this: the mechanism providing power is created for specific conditions. When it is applied in fundamentally different circumstances, it begins to act destructively. For the Mongols, that mechanism was horses. I say this literally, without any metaphor. Every operational decision, every tactical formation, every logistical calculation, every strategic plan of the Mongol army was based on the capabilities, needs, and limitations of Mongol horses and their riders. Separate the Mongol warrior from his horses, and you are left with just a man standing in a field. For effective combat, Mongol cavalry required several horses per fighter. According to contemporary accounts and logistical studies by scholars who have examined Mongol campaigns in detail, the ratio was between 3 and 5 horses per warrior, one primary riding horse, and the others for rotation, so there was always a fresh animal. For an army of 10,000 men, this means at least 30,000 to 50,000 horses. These animals need vast, constantly available pastures. The steppe provides them in practically unlimited quantities, stretching from Hungary to Manchuria, including the grasslands of Central Asia. The plains of the northern plateau of Persia are sufficient. Northern Syria in the right season is satisfactory. But Palestine, the Jezreel Valley, the Galilean hills, this is Mediterranean scrub and agricultural land, rocky, dry in the summer, without the deep-rooted steppe grass to which Mongol horses had adapted, and on which they maintained their legendary endurance. The land's ability to support the animals of the invading cavalry decreases sharply as one moves west from the interior of Syria into Palestine. It is simply impossible to feed a large Mongol army in the Levant through local pastures. The supply chain had to reach back, and the longer it became, the more fragile it grew. There exists truly fascinating scientific evidence of how serious this problem was in 1260. In particular, researchers studying climate data have discovered that a powerful eruption of the Samalas volcano in Indonesia in 1257, one of the largest volcanic events in the last 2,000 years, significantly exceeding Krakatoa, ejected enough sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to cause noticeable cooling and disruptions in precipitation patterns across the northern hemisphere for several years. Climate research of the period around Ain Jalut revealed signs of a return to particularly warm and dry conditions in the Levant in the summer of 1260, which corresponded to the post-volcanic climate anomaly. The conclusion: the regional capacity for horses was likely at its lowest exactly when the Mongols needed it most. The land was working against them to a greater extent than usual seasonal changes. Now consider the supply chain from the very beginning. The Mongols' closest major logistical base was in Persia, modern-day Iran, approximately 1,600 kilometers to the east. The Mongol heartland in Mongolia is more than 6,400 kilometers away. Everything destined for Kitbuka's troops had to traverse this distance over mountains and rivers, across terrain that with every 100 miles to the west became increasingly unsuitable for steppe logistics. Spare horses, arrows, provisions for men, veterinary supplies for animals, everything and everyone moved at the speed of a pack animal along medieval roads. Compare this with the Mamluks. Their operational base was in Cairo. This is approximately 400 kilometers from the Jezreel Valley, connected by a coastal road along the Mediterranean. The road was flat, well established, and fully controlled by Mamluk territory. The Nile Delta in Egypt, one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world, provided food for men and forage for horses. The Mamluks could afford losses and replenish them. They could keep their horses in combat readiness. They could bring up reserves. Each kilometer to the west that the Mongols advanced improved the logistical position of the Mamluks relative to their own. Qutuz understood this asymmetry. Partly for this reason, he decided to move north and meet the Mongols in Palestine instead of waiting for a siege in Egypt. There is one physical detail that deserves more attention than usual: horseshoes. Mongol ponies were traditionally not shod with iron horseshoes, and this was not an oversight. On the soft, springy turf of the steppe, iron shoes are actually counterproductive, reducing the natural grip of the unshod hoof on the grass. But if you move these horses to the rocky limestone hills of Palestine, the basalt formations of the Jezreel Valley, the hard stone surfaces of Galilee, then the unshod hoof becomes a serious vulnerability. It wears down faster, becomes sensitive, and reduces the effective speed and endurance of the horse on rocky terrain. And the Mamluk horses, which had worked in the Levant for years, were shod. The soil on which the Mongol troops demonstrated their worst results was the familiar operational area for the Mamluks. And this struck a blow at the key tactical system of the Mongols, Mongol military doctrine, including feigned retreat over vast distances, large-scale flanking maneuvers requiring the crossing of many miles at high speed, coordinated multi-column encirclements, needing open space, and the constant endurance of horses, as well as the ability to retreat and regroup at a distance before the enemy could recover. All of this required the horses to be in excellent physical condition, well-fed, and on terrain allowing them to realize their capabilities. If the horses suffer, everything that depends on them suffers. The Jezreel Valley itself does not represent an open steppe. It is an oval plain approximately 25 miles long and 10 miles wide at its widest point. To the west it is bounded by the Mount Carmel Ridge, to the north by the hills of Lower Galilee, and to the southeast by the slopes of Mount Gilboa. These mountains are not insurmountable, but their topographic features are significant enough to limit the operational space for cavalry. The wide encompassing arcs, the room for maneuver required by Mongol tactics, were constrained by geography to such an extent that it reduced the tactical options available to Kitbuka even before the battle began. And I want to emphasize here that, in my view, the generally accepted interpretation of this issue is flawed. Most analyses of Ain Jalut treat the logistical and landscape factors as background conditions, the scenery, not the substance of the story. I believe they play a central role. Hulagu's decision to leave one Tumen in the Levant was not just an error in calculating numbers. It was a misunderstanding that the earth itself had changed the math. One Tumen in an open steppe in favorable conditions with strong horses and short supply lines is a fundamentally different military tool than that same Tumen at the end of a 1,000-mile supply line, with horses operating on unfamiliar rocky terrain without the grass needed to maintain peak form. Kitbuka's forces were weakened even before the battle started. The conditions wore them down. Hulagu was counting on a tool that was already damaged by the long trek to the west. Overextension is not just a shortage of soldiers. It is a shortage of the specific conditions that made your soldiers strong. By September 1260, Kitbuka lacked both. Short pause. If you enjoy this kind of deep analysis, not just what, but why, and the hidden structural forces alike on the video is truly important. It tells the algorithm that such work deserves to be shown to people who take history seriously. I appreciate everyone. Now, about the Mamluks, and I want to strongly object to the interpretation I constantly see in popular history, treating Ain Jalut as a battle of a brave underdog against an indomitable monster, a desperate last stand of a frightened civilization against an irresistible force of nature. This interpretation is not just incomplete. It is actively misleading regarding what made the Mamluk victory possible. The Mamluks were not underdogs. They were the most formidable professional army in the medieval Islamic world, and the reason they were able to defeat the Mongols was that they were, in a literal and direct sense, made of the same material. Let's start with the word Mamluk itself. Translated from Arabic, it means owned. These were slave soldiers, but not slaves in the sense of agricultural laborers or domestic servants. They were military slaves purchased at a young age, usually between 8 and 12, from the Kipchak-Turkic peoples of the Pontic steppe, the vast open spaces north of the Black and Caspian seas. Or they were Kipchak-Turkic nomads of the steppes, people who for generations lived in the saddle, herded livestock, and practiced horse archery as a survival skill. The boys who arrived in Egypt already possessed knowledge that other armies spent years teaching their soldiers. The Ayyubid sultans of Egypt, the dynasty founded by Saladin, had been buying and training these boys as elite soldiers for decades. The logic was simple. You bought a boy with no local attachments, no family ties to regional influential figures, and no tasks other than those you gave him. You trained him, raised him in Islam, and integrated him into a military brotherhood. He owed everything to the Sultan and his regiment. He would fight for it with a ferocity often lacking in conscript soldiers who had homes, families, and places to return to. The system worked exceptionally well, so well that by the mid-13th century, Mamluk regiments became a real military power in Egypt. In 1250, they proved it. They killed the Ayyubid Sultan and seized the throne. By 1260, The Mamluk army was recruiting its fighters from the same Kipchak-Turkic steppe region as always, constantly replenishing itself through the slave trade from the territory of the Golden Horde. Thus, the warriors who fought at Ain Jalut were not significantly different, either in culture or experience, from the Mongol method of warfare. During that period, Mongol armies included a huge number of Kipchak-Turkic riders who had joined Mongol service after the conquest of the steppe. The Mamluks and Mongols were, in essence, replenishing their ranks from the same population. When a Mamluk warrior analyzed the tactics of Mongol cavalry, he saw something familiar, not alien. He was facing a method close to how he himself had learned to fight. The training system that turned these boys into soldiers, known as Furusia, deserves close attention, as it was what distinguished the Mamluks from any other military force the Mongols had encountered. Upon arriving in Egypt, the recruit entered the tabakat, a system of military barracks. He was provided with housing and food, taught the Arabic language, Islamic theology, and jurisprudence, and then trained relentlessly. For many years, the Furusia curriculum included mounted archery, both at stationary targets and moving targets at various speeds, which was critical for real cavalry battles. Also studied was swordsmanship, especially the kilai, a curved, single-edged saber, optimized for slashing blows from horseback. Spear technique, horsemanship at the highest level far exceeding just the ability to sit in a saddle and, importantly, coordinated unit maneuvering, or the ability to perform complex cavalry movements as a single unit. This meant the unit acted as an organized force capable of simultaneous actions in different sectors of the battlefield, rather than as a group of disparate individual fighters, each acting on their own. This last element is the hardest to grasp, and it was precisely what made the Mamluks truly unique. For example, a feigned retreat seems simple. You must retreat convincingly, force the enemy to pursue, and then turn and attack. But executing this in practice requires every person in the retreating unit to maintain discipline while creating the impression of flight. The instinct when you are galloping away from an enemy shooting at your back is to actually flee. Maintaining formation during a feigned retreat requires years of training, absolute trust between soldiers, and a kind of collective psychological fortitude that very few military organizations in history have achieved. The Mamluks had this. This was no accident. It was the result of Furusia. Their equipment gave them special advantages in the conditions of the Levant. Heavy Mamluk cavalry wore lamellar iron cuirasses. Chainmail hauberks reached the knees. Conical helmets with chainmail aventails protected the lower face and neck. Their horses were larger than Mongol ponies, bred from Central Asian and Arabian breeds, with more mass and power, better adapted for close-quarters shock combat that occurred on a compressed battlefield. While Mongol cavalry doctrine emphasized maneuver, range, and fast offensive engagement, Mamluk cavalry was built to close in with the enemy and engage in hand-to-hand combat, where heavier equipment and stronger horses decided the outcome. The topographical features of the Jezreel Valley made this type of combat more likely. Here it is worth mentioning the midfa, an early handheld firearm used by the Mamluks at Ain Jalut. Modern historians sometimes dismiss it as a curiosity, pointing out that it could not have caused much harm. This is an absolutely incorrect understanding. The military function of the Mamluk midfa at Ain Jalut was not to destroy Mongol soldiers, but to scare Mongol horses. A cavalry charge, the main offensive weapon of the Mongols, depends on the horses maintaining momentum and directional coherence. A sudden explosion near a horse that has never encountered gunpowder causes it to shy away, turn, or bolt. Disrupt the coherence of the attacking cavalry formation, and you disrupt the attack. The Mamluks, apparently, used the midfa exactly in those moments when disrupting the cohesion of the Mongol cavalry would be most destructive, during the critical transition between the feigned retreat and the ambush. It was a precise psychological weapon applied against the most sensitive component of the Mongol tactical system. And then there was Baibars, Rukn al-Din Baibars al-Bundukdari, a man who would become sultan by the evening of September 3, after a political assassination that we will discuss later. But his military genius at Ain Jalut transcends the moral complexity of his subsequent actions. Baibars was bought as a slave in Syria, sold to Egypt, and climbed the Mamluk military hierarchy to become one of Kutuz's senior commanders. After the Mongols occupied Damascus in early 1260, he fled through the Palestinian countryside, through Galilee, through the hills rising above the Jezreel Valley, through the very terrain where the battle would take place. He knew it the way a person knows a place they have hidden in, not from a map, but from the inside. He knew which ridges could hide cavalry. He knew how the morning sun fell on the floor of the valley. He knew where the trees were dense enough to hide reserve forces. This information Kitbuka could not have obtained from any intelligence reports. It was his personal, hard-won, experiential knowledge that could not be replaced. The combat plan designed by Baibars was a direct translation of intelligence into a tactical scheme. Every element of terrain unfavorable to the Mongols was viewed as an advantage, not a disadvantage. It was chosen precisely because it limited their strength and gave the Mamluks an advantage. This was not improvisation under pressure. This was meticulous preparation. Kitbuka did not fall into a desperate last battle, but into a trap artfully set by those who understood him better than he understood himself. To realize why Kitbuka fell for the feigned retreat trick, one must understand something that is extremely difficult to appreciate from a modern perspective. What was it like to be a Mongol commander in 1260? For 50 years, the Mongol military machine had not suffered practically a single definitive defeat in open field battles, not one of significance. There were, of course, some difficulties. The campaign in Vietnam got bogged down in jungles and disease. The sea expedition to Japan was crushed by storms. Failures and friction arose in various peripheral battles. But on the main theater of operations, in the steppes and open spaces where the Mongols were created to conduct cavalry warfare, no one could defeat them. The accumulated institutional memory of the Mongol army contained no scenarios where enemy cavalry successfully executed complex tactical deceptions against them. It simply didn't exist in their combat history. Now imagine what that did to a commander's mind. After 50 years of victories, some assumptions stopped being assumptions and turned into something close to absolute truths. Feigned retreat works when we use it because our enemies break formation to pursue. Our enemies break formation because they lack the discipline to hold when we flee. Our enemies lack the discipline because they weren't trained the way we were. These statements were true for 50 years. They were reliably, stably, empirically true, and Kitbuka's entire operational worldview was built upon them. The feigned retreat as a tactic is the hallmark of the Mongols. Their most reliable, most destructive tactical weapon. It is effective across different cavalry cultures because it exploits an almost universal human reaction. The sight of a retreating enemy triggers an instinct to pursue at a level that overrides rational tactical caution. Every warrior instinct screams, "They are running. Don't let them get away. Exploit the advantage." Suppressing this instinct requires special training, collective discipline, and a commander capable of holding his men back when every psychological signal screams, "Forward." Most armies in history could not do this. The Mongols had skillfully exploited this human flaw for half a century. They used it against Russian princes, whose cavalry would break formation and pursue retreating Mongol units right into an encirclement. They used it against Polish and Hungarian knights at Legnica and Mohi in 1241. Heavy armored cavalry, brave men on good horses who simply could not resist the temptation to pursue what appeared to be a fleeing enemy. They used it against Seljuk and Turkish cavalry, against Chinese armies, against Persian forces. The scheme was so reliable that it became almost automatic. Simulate a retreat. The enemy pursues. Turn. Destroy. Baibars was playing the same hand. And here is the specific idea that makes this so analytically interesting. He could pull it off because he grew up in a culture that used this tactic. His Kipchak origins, combined with years of training in Furusya in exactly this kind of coordinated cavalry maneuvering, meant that the feigned retreat was not a tactic he needed to decipher by observation. It was in his military DNA. He understood from the inside what made it work, what led to failure, and most importantly, what discipline was required to execute it convincingly without breaking formation under fire. The staging of the Battle of Ain Jalut was extremely meticulous, which speaks to serious planning. The main strength of the Mamluks, the overwhelming majority of Kutuz's army, was hiding in the wooded ridges surrounding the valley, even before the battle began, not during, but before. They had taken positions under cover of darkness or before dawn and remained immobile. This is no small feat. Keeping cavalry horses silent and motionless for many hours in close proximity, without the noise and bustle that could have given away their location, requires a level of training and unit-level discipline that most medieval armies simply could not achieve. Baibars moved forward with the vanguard into the open part of the valley. These were the forces that Kitbuka saw. For several hours, this unit, the understanding of how this weapon worked and how it failed, is critically important to realizing why Ain Jalut was not just a military defeat, but a turning point for the civilized world. Remember how the Mongol Empire expanded throughout the decades of its greatest conquests. The Mongols didn't just arrive and engage in combat, they arrived ahead of themselves. Before the Mongol army reached a city, its inhabitants already received detailed reports, whether from refugees, merchants, or as a result of the Mongols' targeted psychological operations about the fate of the previous city. The scheme was clear and immutable. Cities that offered resistance were destroyed with a tenacity unprecedented for medieval warfare. The population was exterminated or enslaved. Buildings were erased from the face of the earth. Agricultural infrastructure was purposefully destroyed. The message was unambiguous. The Mongols consciously reinforced it. Cities that surrendered quickly received relatively good treatment, were taxed, governed, and integrated into the empire. Local rulers who cooperated with the Mongols sometimes retained their positions, and trade was generally protected. The Mongols were not mindless nihilists. Their nihilism was strategic, and the destruction served a clear goal. The message was simple: submit, and you will survive. Resist, and you will disappear. Rational calculation favored submission, and the Mongols spared no effort to make this calculation as obvious as possible. The looting of Baghdad in 1258 became the most vivid expression of this strategy. When the Mongols destroyed Baghdad, they didn't just defeat a military opponent. They sent a message to every potential opponent between them and the Atlantic. The Abbasid Caliphate, an institution that embodied Sunni Islamic political and spiritual leadership for more than 5 centuries, whose legitimacy traced back to the family of the Prophet, was wiped off the face of the earth in a week. The Caliph was executed. The House of Wisdom, one of the greatest libraries of the medieval world, was destroyed. The story about the Tigris, whose waters turned black from ink, may be a legend, but the destruction of the library itself was a real and documented fact. The psychological impact on the Islamic world was colossal. This was not just a political shock, but something close to existential despair. If Baghdad fell, what could stand? It was in this atmosphere that in 1260, Hulagu's emissaries arrived in Cairo, demanding Qutuz's submission. The demand was backed by the most successful terror campaign in medieval history, and Qutuz killed the messengers. He didn't refuse them diplomatically. He didn't send them back with a defiant reply, but killed them. Their heads were displayed on the Bab Zuayla Gate in Cairo, the city's main southern gate, so the inhabitants could see. This was not impulsiveness. Qutuz was not an impulsive man. This was a calculated, public, irreversible signal that he rejected not only the demands, but the entire system within which this demand was made. Every ruler who submitted to the Mongols implicitly recognized their thesis that resistance was pointless, and submission was the only rational exit, that the Mongols were an elemental force, before which rational players had no choice. Qutuz, however, openly, publicly, and with full awareness of the consequences, rejected this thesis. Why could Qutuz do this when many others couldn't? In part, it was his personality. He was a former military slave who had seized the Sultanate through violence in 1259. A man without a dynastic legacy that needed protection, and therefore, without the inherent caution that goes with it. In part, it was a strategic calculation. He understood that Hulagu had left with the main army, that the window of opportunity was narrow, and that if he were going to fight the Mongols at all, this was the best moment he would ever have. But the decisive role was played by an ideological reassessment that the destruction of Baghdad made possible. The fall of the Abbasid Caliphate created a vacuum, a role someone had to fill, and the Mamluks were ready to take on that role. With the disappearance of the Caliphate, Qutuz and Baibars presented the Mamluk Sultanate as the last line of defense for Islamic civilization, not one of many states fighting for influence, but the very last line, the place where the Mongol invasion would stop or everything would be lost. This formulation was sincere. It was not pure propaganda, because the threat was real, and it transformed the upcoming battle from a political conflict into a sacred duty. People who fight for the survival of their civilization and their faith fight differently than people who fight because their commander ordered them to. They hold their ground longer. They endure more suffering. They continue to fight when rational calculation suggests retreat. This ideological aspect had a direct military consequence in the moment of crisis at the Battle of Ain Jalut, when the Mongols broke through the left flank of the Mamluk line. And they did break through. but the chronicles clearly testify that the battle was repeatedly on the verge of turning, rather than just being a complete rout of a defenseless opponent by the Mamluks. Kutuz took off his helmet. He intentionally revealed himself in the very center of the battle, where visibility meant becoming a target. He rode forward, shouting a war cry. His troops held. They transitioned to a counterattack. They managed to turn a breakthrough into a restoration of positions, the ideological foundation, a sense of sacred duty, as well as the understanding that there was nowhere to retreat, endowed Mamluk warriors with a quality that pure military training can never fully replicate, the meaning of standing until the end, surpassing personal survival. Compare this with the Mongol army. By 1260, the empire was a multi-religious entity in which the shared identity, we serve the great Khan, we fight for the empire, was crumbling under the influence of religious differences and the struggle for succession. Kitbuka was a Nestorian Christian, and his army included Armenian and Georgian Christian units, Mongol animist cavalry, as well as Syrian Muslim auxiliary soldiers who deserted right during the battle. A transcendent shared goal did not exist. When the situation deteriorated, the coalition, held together by conquests and authority, began to crack at the ideological seams, the deepest meaning of psychological superiority. And here I want to be as precise as possible, because I believe this is the most important single conclusion about why it mattered. It is not a property of the army that possesses it. It is a property of the relationship between that army and everyone else. It exists in the minds of the people who believe in it. And at the moment someone publicly and unambiguously demonstrates that an invincible force can be defeated in open combat, the mechanism flips in the opposite direction. Every future opponent now has a starting point, and every doubting population now has a reason to resist. Every city that previously would have submitted now has a precedent hinting that resistance could be successful. Ain Jalut did not just defeat Kitbuka's army. It destroyed the Mongols' most powerful weapon. The confidence disappeared and never returned in the same way. Consider what happened immediately after. Hulagu managed to send reinforcements to Tumans back to Syria in December 1260. They sacked Aleppo, carried out a massacre of Muslims in retaliation for Kitbuka, moved toward Palestine, and then, about 2 weeks later, were forced to retreat. They couldn't continue the campaign not because the Mamluks beat them in a second field battle, but because the logistical and political conditions that made the first campaign impossible had not changed. What is more important, the Mamluk army, having already defeated the Mongols once, mobilized based on demonstrated combat capability, not desperate hope. The psychological asymmetry had changed. The Mamluks knew they could win. The Mongols knew they could lose. Let's clarify one point before moving on to further events. The Mongols tried to return. The standard historical account, Ain Jalut stopped the Mongols, creates the impression as if they just left and found something better to do. In reality, the Ilkhanate undertook numerous serious attempts to reconquer Syria and Egypt over the following 4 decades. And every time, these attempts failed. Understanding the reasons for these failures tells us something important about the depth of the structural changes triggered by Ain Jalut. The attempt of December 1260, which we already mentioned. 2 Tumans, the sacking of Aleppo, an advance toward Palestine, retreat in about 2 weeks due to the impossibility of maintaining the campaign. Then in 1262, a full-scale war erupted between Berke and Hulagu. It was waged along the Caucasian border and for years consumed the military potential of the Ilkhanate. Hulagu died in 1265. His son and successor, Möngke Khan, who was not a Muslim, which is important for the future, did not undertake major campaigns against Syria for more than 10 years. In 1281, significant Mongol forces under the command of Möngke Timur crossed the Euphrates, reached northern Syria, and were defeated at the Second Battle of Homs by the Mamluk army, operating from a carefully prepared defensive depth that Baibars had been building for 15 years. The Mongols retreated. In 1299-1300, Ghazan Khan, who had converted to Islam, a development we will discuss, crossed Syria with a large army and effectively occupied Damascus for a time. This fact is often omitted in the simplified narrative. Ain Jalut stopped the Mongols because it complicates the clean story. But Ghazan's occupation did not hold. He retreated in early 1300. When he returned the following year, the Mamluks met him and eventually forced a new retreat. And the final, last chapter came at the Battle of Marj al-Safar, near Damascus. In April 1303, Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad defeated the Ilkhanate army in a major battle. After 1303, the Mongols never again undertook serious attempts at invading Egypt or the Levant. The question was settled: why did every subsequent attempt fail? For several mutually reinforcing reasons. The problems of logistics and terrain did not go away. Every Mongol force that crossed the Euphrates and headed west faced the same difficulties in supply. The same terrain, increasingly inhospitable to steppe cavalry, the same lengthening supply lines. These problems could not be overcome by Mongol military skill, bravery, or tactical superiority. These were structural features of geography. Baibars' intelligence system gave the Mamluks a decisive operational advantage. He expanded the Mamluk postal relay network so extensively that information between Damascus and Cairo was transmitted in 4 days instead of 2 weeks. This meant Mamluk troops could be mobilized before Mongol armies finished crossing the Euphrates. The asymmetry of initiative, usually favoring the attacker, was neutralized. The Mamluks knew of the Mongols' approach before they appeared. The Mamluk alliance with the Golden Horde remained functional and strategically significant for decades. The continuous influx of Kipchak Turkic warriors from the territory of the Golden Horde into the Mamluk military apparatus meant the Mamluks could maintain their military quality even with losses. More importantly, the hostility of the Golden Horde toward the Hulaguids meant any major Mongol campaign against Egypt faced the strategic problem of a two-front war. A potential attack from the north had to be considered, and Baibars' systematic dismantling of the Crusader states removed potential Mongol allies from the strategic map. Caesarea fell in 1265, Arsuf in 1265, Safed in 1266, Jaffa and Antioch in 1268. These actions were motivated not only by religious hostility. They were a strategic necessity. Every surviving Crusader principality was a gap in the Mamluks' defensive line, a potential bridgehead that Mongol forces could use to bypass Egyptian defensive installations or receive reinforcements. By eliminating them, Baibars simplified the strategic problem and deprived the Mongols of options they could have exploited. The great irony of the post-Mongol period lies in the conversion of the Hulaguids to Islam. Ghazan Khan's conversion in 1295 meant that the Mongol dynasty that destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate and put the Islamic world on the verge of an existential crisis became a Muslim ruling house within a generation. The civilization they had come to destroy absorbed them. Does this justify the Mamluks' resistance? Or does it simply reflect the extraordinary assimilation power of Islamic culture in the medieval world, or both? A question to ponder. The Mamluks ruled Egypt and the Levant until 1517, when the Ottoman armies of Selim I destroyed the Sultanate at the Battle of Ridania, near Cairo, 257 years later. What was set in motion on the morning of September 1260? Let's conduct a counterfactual analysis. Historians rarely address it directly, but I believe it is one of the most useful analytical tools we have, not to fantasize about alternative histories, but to test the cause and effect relationships we claim about what actually happened. If Möngke Khan had not died in August 1259, if he had lived another 5 years, completed the campaign against the Song, and directed the entire Mongol imperial machine to the west, would Ain Jalut have happened as it did? I think the honest answer is almost certainly no. Hulagu, with a full army, 100,000 or more cavalrymen, not under the pressure of a succession crisis, not constrained by the hostility of Möngke Khan, could have brought such a mass that would have allowed them to overcome the logistical problems through sheer weight. If the terrain were still unfavorable, supply lines still strained, but with enough numbers, you absorb losses and continue the movement. The Mamluks, facing such a force, would have encountered a fundamentally different problem than the one Qutuz faced. This is uncomfortable, because it means the battle that saved Islamic civilization, as Muslim historians have formulated it, for 700 years, and not without reason, depended, at least partially, on a death in a river valley in Sichuan province that had nothing to do with Islam or the Middle East. Illness, or an arrow, or the decision of a campaign in South China triggered a chain of events that ended with Kitbuka's head on a Palestinian battlefield. Randomness is real. History is not a story moving inexorably toward a predetermined outcome. It is a series of moments where everything could have gone differently. But, and this is a more important analytical point, recognizing randomness does not mean reducing the Mamluk victory to luck. The Mamluks did not just take advantage of Möngke's death, and they were not just lucky. They made specific decisions over several years that allowed them to exploit the opportunity created by his death. They were preparing for this battle when most of the Islamic world was still in shock. They built up military potential. They developed diplomatic alliances. They killed the messengers at exactly the right strategic moment. They moved north when the rational defensive instinct told them to wait. Every significant decision from 1258 to September 1260 was correct. Luck favors the prepared. Kutus and Baibars demonstrated exceptional preparation. So, what really stopped the Mongols at Ain Jalut? Let me, without any reservations, present to you a synthesis of 6 factors, because in this case, clarity is more important than evasion. The power vacuum at the top of the Mongol Empire, arising after Möngke's death, withdrew the main army from the theater of operations exactly when the campaign should have culminated. This was not a minor oversight, but a structural weakness in the empire's political system. The requirement of the Kurultai meant that succession crises automatically led to the cessation of military operations, and Möngke's death occurred at the worst possible time. Radical strategic overextension in conditions of climate and terrain that degraded every component of the Mongol army's combat capability, horse health, logistical resilience, and the operational space needed for their characteristic tactics. The Levant was an unsuitable environment for the Mongol military machine. By 1260, this incompatibility had intensified to such a degree that Kitbuka's troops were operating at significantly reduced efficiency, even before the battle began. An opponent that was culturally, tactically, and experientially nearly equal. The Mamluks were not some other army that somehow neutralized the Mongols with superior technology or defensive terrain. They were a similar army of steppe origin, cavalry-based, trained in the same tactical traditions, with institutional discipline that matched or exceeded the Mongol one in the specific requirements of the battlefield. The battlefield was chosen and prepared to eliminate the Mongols' advantage. The topographical limitations of the Jezreel Valley deprived the Mongols of the operational space needed for their tactics and steered the fight toward close-quarters cavalry collision, where the advantages of Mamluk equipment were most decisive. The feigned retreat, the Mongols' own signature weapon, was used against them by an enemy that possessed both the tactical knowledge and the unit discipline to execute it convincingly. This is not irony. It is the logical consequence of fighting an opponent formed by the same military tradition. The destruction of psychological invincibility, the collapse of the Mongols' most powerful weapon, their confidence in victory and their enemies' despair. Once broken, this could not be restored. A precedent existed. A model of resistance had been established. Each factor individually was surmountable, but together, in this specific combination, at this specific moment, they proved fatal. Here, it is worth noting a wider pattern, as it is applicable far beyond the medieval world. The Mongols were defeated at Ain Jalut in part because their own extraordinary success made them cognitively inflexible. A century of victories following the same template eliminated the institutional ability to question that template. They could not imagine that a feigned retreat could be false, because retreating enemies always retreated for real. They could not imagine that their reputation might not paralyze a specific opponent, because it had always paralyzed everyone before. The accumulated confidence of 50 years of victories became a blind spot, and a military force with a known blind spot, facing an opponent who knows exactly where it is always just a matter of time. The historical epilogue is wrapped in irony, which I find truly beautiful. The Ilkhanate, the dynasty that destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate and plunged the Islamic world into crisis, whose commander perished at Ain Jalut, converted to Islam within 50 years of the battle. Ghazan Khan, the ruler who undertook the last serious attempt at invasion in 1303, was himself a Muslim. The civilization they came to destroy ended up inside them, regardless of whether you view this as redemption, historical justice, or simply the extraordinary absorbing power of a great civilization. It is the kind of finale that no one standing in the Jezreel Valley on the 3rd of September 1260 could have predicted, and that makes it more true to how history actually works, not less. So, here is what I keep returning to. Ain Jalut is not the day the Mongols were beaten by a superior force. It is the day they encountered a mirror, an army built on the same steppe tradition, trained in the same tactical language, and led by a commander who spent his entire life studying the terrain on which they were to fight, and discovered that their most powerful weapon works both ways. Feigned retreat, psychological dominance, confidence in victory, all of this turned against them, and was used with the precision of men who understood it from the inside. 6 factors, 1 result. A world moving on a completely different path because of this. If the Mamluks had lost that battle, there would be no buffer between the Mongols and the coast of North Africa. The Islamization of the Ilkhanate likely would not have happened without the subsequent diplomatic architecture of the Mamluks and the Golden Horde. The Ottoman Empire, whose rise was predicated on Mamluk dominance, would have either emerged in a completely different form or not appeared at all. The modern Middle East would have been shaped by different forces. One single fight at a spring in the Jezreel Valley weighed so much. That is what I find eternally fascinating about this kind of history. The thread you pull never ends. The consequences stretch much further than the contemporaries could have imagined, and understanding the deep structural factors underlying the battle, the overextension of forces, the landscape, equal opportunities, the psychological foundation provides something more valuable than just a story about a winner and a loser. It provides tools for detecting similar patterns in different conditions, in different eras, and in different corners of the world. If this video brought you value, opened a new perspective on analysis, or provided a foundation for thinking about the causes of imperial decline, I would be sincerely grateful for a like. It contributes to my channel reaching those who value history at this level of depth. I put a lot of time into ensuring my materials are valuable to you. And if you are not yet subscribed, click the button. The next video will be dedicated to Baibars himself, the man who, while saving the Islamic world, killed his sultan a few hours later, and then became one of the most remarkable strategists of the Middle Ages, spending 17 years on the systematic destruction of everything the Crusades had created. This is a story about what genius looks like when it is combined with ruthlessness, acting at exactly the right historical moment, possessing the right resources, and facing the right enemies. This is truly an extraordinary story, and I cannot wait to tell it. Thank you for watching.